Hello, and welcome back to Sinister Seminar. I'm your host, Richard Berwind, and this is a History of Horror podcast, where today we will be discussing Ari Aster's 2019 sophomore film, Midsommar. If you haven't already, please check out episode 1.1, where we explored the concept of the ancient Greek chorus. And in this episode, we will be doing a plot breakdown of this film. There will be spoilers, so proceed with caution, and make sure to check out show notes for any and all content warnings. With all that being said, class is in session. Hello, it's me, Richard, and welcome back to Sinister Seminar, where this week we are getting a little out of stupid. And we're going to be talking about one of my favorite movies of all time, that being Midsommar. As you can tell by the title of this episode, and if you're coming from my social media, I've been posting about it. But this, to me, may be a little shocking to listeners, but this movie, to me, is a comfort film for me. I put this on as a way to relax and just kind of come to peace, if that makes any sense. And you may be thinking, that's really weird, especially if you've seen this movie before. This is a movie that is anything but peaceful. But to me, I think it's just the combination of the music, the filmography, the score, the location, it all just kind of, for me, comes together and is this beautiful, escapist fairy tale. And Ari Aster before has called this movie a fucked up fairy tale. And I'll bring up a couple of moments where it feels like a fairy tale to me. But that, alongside Danny's, ability to find acceptance in her emotions, or finds people who can validate her emotions, I think is very comforting to me. But we'll get into the controversy surrounding that, or I guess the conversation that is this a happy ending or not? I think it can be both at the same time, but once we get to the ending, I think I'll talk about it a little bit more. Now, I first watched this movie back when it came out not in theaters, but on streaming. So that would have been March or April of 2020. And, I think we can all understand what was happening in the world at that moment in time. Though, if you're listening to this in 2056 and you're like, what happened in 2020? The thing is we went into lockdown because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the Trump administration treated it terribly, and it was a whole mess. It was a whole thing. But I remember distinctly being in my childhood bedroom watching Midsommar and being like, man, I wish I could escape all of this and just live out in a commune in the middle of the woods. Even though, I moved back home, and at that point, my parents, we grew up in the Poconos, so I was already out in the middle of the woods, so, that makes no sense, but it's fine. It's fine. It is also a movie that as soon as it wrapped up, I went, this is one of my favorite movies of all time. I just loved it, loved it, loved it. I watched it again to take notes for this podcast, and once again, I was like, I fucking love this movie. Back in 2020, me and some of my friends from high school got over, I think it was Google Meetings, and we watched both Hereditary and Midsommar as a back-to-back, so we took out 6 hours of our lives to watch both of these movies, and it was just such a an experience. I actually do recommend watching both back to back if you have the time to do so, given that, Hereditary starts in the light, in the daylight, and ends in the dark night. And Midsommar starts in the dark night and ends in daylight. So it kind of has this book-ending effect to it as a spiritual double feature. And it's just stuck with me since then because I'm a Cancer. I'm a very emotional person, and the cathartic nature of, you know, this breakup story of Danny being able to maybe find herself, we'll talk about it later, is something that I just keep on coming back to as a person. This need for emotional validation, this contrasted with the beautiful European countryside. It's just, I don't know. I think that's why I keep on coming back to it over and over again. For the purposes of this podcast, I'm coming back to it because I want to cover it for this section on the Greek chorus. And you may be thinking to yourself, one, this is Nordic, this is Swedish, this is not Greek. And two, there is no Greek chorus. Over the last couple of weeks, we've looked at pieces of art that had very distinct groups, actors, who play a choral part. And in this one, nobody really does that. You can argue that the Harga maybe act as a Greek chorus, but that's not where I'm getting at or what I'm getting at. Ari Aster does this really cool thing right out the gate of this movie by telling it from beginning to end in the first scene. And then throughout the rest of the movie, he puts in paintings and runes and other visual imagery that maybe you don't pick up on your first watch through. Maybe it's a second or a third watch through. You start seeing how much of these things inform, or these paintings inform each of the characters' decisions, inform each of the characters' outcomes. There's a lot of foreshadowing, and I think that's what the Greek chorus eventually also becomes, besides the audience surrogate. It becomes a sense of foreshadowing and foreboding for the audience. And I think that gives us a good segue into the movie, because we have to talk about this opening scene. So this movie opens up with the playing of a harp, angelic choral vocalizations, and this 5-part painting fresco that outlines each of the events in this movie. So in the first panel, you see a skull spitting out a snowstorm in the dark onto a scene where Death as a character in knee-length boots holds a red string connecting 4 figures: an older man, an older woman, and 2 younger women, one in pink and the other in brown. In the second panel, the young woman in pink can be seen crying, now with the city as a backdrop to her sorrow. A short-haired man comforts the woman in pink, but in this weird manner. If you I can't explain exactly what this weird manner is. Once you see it, you'll understand what I'm talking about. Another young man watches from above, accompanied by 3 birds. He is writing or perhaps drawing in a notebook. In the third panel, the young man in the trees plays the flute and leads a band of merry men and the young woman through the woods. There is the jester, the academic, and the short-haired man, as well as the woman in pink. And in this case, we see the fucked up fairy tale again. We see the Pied Piper. In the fourth panel, the group arrives through a sun-shaped portal, and we are greeted by a community in white, presenting the group with either golden chalices or skulls. Below them, is a bear and an oxen, and above them is a wooden throne or a chair with presumably a ring of smoke accompanying it. There is also a cliff face and what appears to be two older angels jumping from it. In the fifth panel, there is a jubilee around the maypole where maidens in flower crowns dance with skeletons in flower crowns. A band of skeletons can also be seen playing the drums and the fiddle. A meal of 8 people can also be seen as part of this celebration. There is also the creepiest smiling sun looking down upon this celebration. Outlining this entire 5-part fresco painting, there are many, many Nordic ruins. The movie finally opens up to a snowy scene and a woman singing in Swedish. This is interrupted by a telephone ring and shots of suburban life. No one picks up the phone, and the person calling is sent directly to voicemail. We'll learn that this is Danny. This is cut with images and frames from the Ardor residence, soccer matches, family gatherings, things like that. But in our first, or I guess our second moment of the Greek chorus, or foreshadowing, at some point in all of these images, we see a picture of Danny wearing a flower crown. Hold that in your back pocket for later. Cutting over to Danny in her apartment, she is seen reading emails that her sister has sent her. This email says, "Dear Danny, I can't anymore. Everything's black. Mom and Dad are coming too. Goodbye." And this email was sent an hour ago. Danny responds to this email in a series of 3 emails. They go, question mark, what is this supposed to mean? Question mark. Terry? Question mark. I don't understand you writing this and just leaving me with it. At least pick up your phone, please. And those 3 emails were sent an hour ago, 42 minutes ago, and 19 minutes ago, respectively. And in another moment of little foreshadowing, we get to see a whole bunch of other emails that were sent to Danny in her inbox. One is from Christian, one is from something called Academic Newsletter, and 2 others from her sister. Now, the 2 from her sister are just YouTube links. One sent December 19th. This one is called A Relaxing Yellowstone Video. And the other one sent December 14th is 3D VR filmed in space. Now, I want to talk about these really quick and what they could possibly mean as a sense of foreshadowing or foreboding. I think Yellowstone, growing up, we hear about Yellowstone because we know that one day it's supposed to blow up because it's a volcano. It's supposed to blow up and it will cause immense amounts of devastation because it's a super volcano. So the fact that it's like a relaxing Yellowstone video is kind of interesting. It's kind of like almost like a double entendre, or 2 things that are not supposed to be the same, because you're almost like watching it with a sense of foreboding. You know what I mean? It's like one day this is going to explode and cause intense amounts of devastation. And the other one, being the 3D VR filmed in space, is also interesting. It's harder to interpret, but I think it's just the existentialism that comes with staring at space. Because at the end of the day, I think this movie is kind of an existential horror. It doesn't have any the cosmic horror aliens or anything, but it definitely has that deep existential dread to it. And so I think with the Yellowstone video, or in the space video, we get to see that her sister's mind a little bit more, that existential dread that she may be feeling. And the Yellowstone video could be a view of what's to come, as we will eventually see, but this underlying explosion. In the other email in the academic newsletter, it says, "Are you networking? you should be. And, networking as a way to, not quite build community, but like, in a sense, build community in order to like find a job post grad. In this, we learned that, yes, Danny is in college, possibly grad school. I think it's kind of, Danny's age is something that is quite contested in discussion around this movie. Some people think that she's like 22, 23. Others think she might be like 27, 28. But really, ultimately, it doesn't quite matter. We know that she's kind of like in her mid 20s. So this networking thing tells us she's in college, but also it's like, I think to me, it foreshadows the Harga and the community of the Harga. In the email with Christian, it is a what do you think? I'm going to guess that Danny had forwarded this email to Christian to be like, what do you think is happening with this? And I would assume that it's a email chain. We don't get to see any of it besides an email from Christian that says, sure, might get there late, which comes up in like 5 seconds. So we'll get back to that. We see Danny calling Christian. She's trying to like pretend everything's normal and she's like holding back tears. She asks him if he wants to do anything later. And he's like, well, did we have plans? Maybe I can swing by later. I'm hanging out with my friends. Which is immediately that email. He was like, sure, I might get there late. But he said, sure. He's like, I don't know. I'm like, whatever. Christian. He does end up asking about her sister. Danny gives like a little bit of an update. It's not much of an update. She's just like, she's nervous. Christian's like, it'll probably be fine. And he like makes fun of Danny and her sister or like disparages them. And he's like, she does this every other day and only because you let her. Danny's like, she's bipolar and I can only do what I can. But Christian brushes her off and repeats like, but you do though, babe. You do allow her to do this. And Danny just like concedes to Christian's insistence and is like, I'm very lucky to have you. And he gives a reluctant, I love you before they hang up the phone. And let me just say, if I ever had a partner that spoke about my siblings in that way, you'd never see them again. I'm so sorry. They would be disappeared. Like what do you mean I'm letting them do this? Like I love my siblings. Like why? That's insane behavior. The term gaslighting is used a lot in discussion about this movie. And it's kind of a point of contention on whether or not Christian is in fact gaslighting her. And if what he does throughout the movie could be considered gaslighting. If anything, it's just narcissistic behavior, in my opinion. And I'll get into it a little bit more. We see the tension in this relationship already. And we're only like 5 minutes into the movie. Danny ends up calling one of her friends to talk about Christian, and she's like, I think I'm pushing away with all my family stuff. And her friend is like, girl, get it together. And this entire scene is done in a bathroom vanity mirror where she goes in and she grabs a prescription for, I think it was Ativan. So we also get to see that Danny also has like issues with anxiety and depression. Now this friend is really my type of gal. She's like, good riddance. He's just a man. There's another one around the corner. If he's treating you like this and he's making you feel like shit, then dump him. Get away from him. During this conversation, Danny proceeds to write her sister another email, but before she can hit send, an unknown caller interrupts. We cut over to Christian and his friends in a pizza shop where we meet Mark, Josh, and Pele. Mark is telling Christian to just break up with her, and Christian is conflicted about might wanting her back in the future, and that's why he isn't breaking up with her, because he feels like he wants to be needed. That's his entire thing. You know what I mean? He wants to be needed by his friends and by his girlfriend. And Josh is like, you're just using this as an excuse to not do your PhD thesis, which I think is very reductive about the entire thing. I think it has more to do with the fact that Christian has these like underlying narcissistic tendencies and this intense need to be wanted by people so he can control the situation. But that's just my thing. That's just my reading. Danny ends up calling Christian again, and Mark is like, bro, this is so abused. Like, she's abusing you. Like, bro, you just need to, like, leave her. Like, what the fuck? This is so abusive. Christian ends up getting up from the table and picks up the phone, and we can just hear this absolute guttural scream let out by Danny through the phone. And she's, like, screaming. She's crying. She's going, no, 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 no. And we can only assume the worst has happened. And I believe it was the Girl That's Scary podcast that has said this before, but Ari Aster knows how to take the breath out of an entire movie theater with his direction, with his writing, with his storytelling, because just like in Hereditary, where Toni Collette's character finds something in a car and screams and cries, you just get this like deep, intense pit in your gut. We cut to a scene, a slow motion scene where firefighters are entering the Arter residence. They turn off the cars in the garage and we see a hose duct taped to the tailpipe. They follow the hose through the house upstairs to find that one end was taped under the bedroom door of the parents. They find both dead and zip them up in body bags. They also find another hose taped to the sister's mouth where she died choking on her vomit. Above her head are all of Danny's emails, unread. What a scene to open up this movie. Holy shit. It's just awful. We see Christian crossing a snowstorm, finding his way to Danny's apartment, and from outside, he hears her wailing. We hear her wailing. Inside, she curls up on his lap, and he, like, kind of comforts her, kind of. He kind of just, like, pats her back, and it's like, it's going to be okay. Meanwhile, she's, like, still guttural, crying. Above the two of them, there is a painting of two moons surrounded by other circles, and another of what appears to be a woman running through the woods. We'll see that later. I mean, we'll see it again in closer detail in a few scenes. I'm still kind of pondering what the two suns could mean. I think I understand the woman running through the woods. I think it's the scene where the group makes their way to the Harga commune through the woods, or even possibly, I already said spoiler alerts, but when we hear that Connie had been running like a track star, I think that could possibly be a foreshadowing moment for her. The twin suns, I'm not 100% sold on. So please, if you are listening to this, comment and let me know what your interpretation of that is. Through this, the music increases in intensity and we zoom into the snowstorm where we get our title card. It just kind of gets more and more and more intense, and then it is now summer. And we move from outside a zoom in from outside of Danny's apartment to inside, where she is just kind of laid up in bed, curled under a painting of a princess examining a very large bear. And that one is, I'm not going to get into it because I feel like it is very obvious as to what that is later on. Christian then comes in to check on Danny, and he tells her that he's going to a party for like 45 minutes. Like, I'll just be gone for 45 minutes, babe. It's obviously not going to be for 45 minutes. Like, who goes to a party for 45 minutes? Like, and she says that she'll come with him, but he insists that she stays and gets more sleep. Like, he just wants to go out. Danny insists, and we cut to the party where Danny is just kind of like standing there zoning out as Josh mentions that, talking to someone, that all of them are going to Europe for their thesis, which snaps Danny immediately out of it. Through this like little conversation, we see that Pele is staring directly at Danny. Josh mentions that he's doing his thesis on Midsummer traditions around Europe, and everyone else is just kind of tagging along. Danny looks at Christian like this is the first time she's hearing about this. Christian just kind of goes, "Oh, like we were talking about it. Like I'm not even gonna go," even though the plane tickets were already bought and he was obviously going. And the entire group just kind of like stands there awkwardly as we see him like actively gaslighting her. Once again, is this gaslighting? Who knows? But I'm gonna call it gaslighting. We then see Danny and Christian in the back of a cab. It's just an awkward moment. You can feel the tension in the air. Entering the apartment, Danny confronts Christian about the trip, and we get this conversation through a mirror where we only see Danny in full, but Christian in the mirror, and mirrors are often used throughout this movie as a way to show the kind of like this masking of the characters, their lies, the I want to call it their shadow selves, just because I'm ooh woo spiritual, whatever. But it's the selves that they're not being truthful about. And so we see Christian, like in the mirror, and Danny is like, I had no idea you were going. And Christian's like, well, I wanted to go. I just decided today I was going. Danny is understandably upset about it. Danny is like, well, be in my shoes. Like, imagine you went to a party and you heard that your partner was going to a foreign country for 3 months and they didn't tell you. And Christian's like, well, that's not what I was doing. And like, you're being crazy. Danny is upset. She walks over to him to where Danny's desk is. And behind this desk, we see a corkboard of many, many memories, including another painting of what, like, kind of looks like Free Willy. It kind of looks like someone is freeing a whale, which I think, in a sense, will be Danny's character later on in the movie. Cutting back to the conversation, Christian's like, you know what? I'm just gonna go home. And anytime Danny is like, well, like, let's talk about this. Like, I don't want you to seem like I'm like angry at you or coming at you. And Christian's like, I don't know. I'm just going to go home. I'm going to go home. It's like you're attacking me. And it ends up with Danny apologizing. Like, I'm sorry that I made you feel this way. Like, let's just forget about it. And the conversation is cut. And from there, we cut to the interior of one of these guys' apartments. We don't really get confirmation as to whose it is. I'm gonna say it's Mark's, maybe Josh's. I lean more towards Mark because of another thing, but they're all just kind of like sitting around and kind of talking about the trip. Mark says that he wants to go to a meatball sex club in Stockholm, but Pelly's like, we're going straight to Hälsingland. Like, there's no detour. We're getting there and we're going because the first festivities are starting. Christian tells them that Danny is coming up to the apartment. Well, he gets a text and then tells them that she's coming up to the apartment, and they all exchange these glances. The eye acting in this movie is intense, insane, incredible, because you can see exactly what these characters' thoughts are going through their head. It's like painted on their faces. It's incredible. Now in the mirror, because there's like this giant mirror over a couch, Christian tells the group that he invited Danny to come to Sweden, but she's not coming. I like invited her and she accepted, but she's not coming. And you can see that he's trying to like deceive his group, and they're all like, but you invited her. So she's going? She's not going. Well, you invited her, so she said she's going, and she's like, well, she's not going to go. And he lets Danny in. He lets Danny into the apartment. And now Danny is also in the mirror talking with the group. She tries to make pleasantries with the guys. We cut back to them when Danny is speaking. Once again, she's not really deceiving anyone, so we get to see her in full. And when we do this, we get to see a fridge. And on top of that fridge is a picture of the Scarecrow from The Wizard of Oz. Who has that in their apartment, first off? Who has that in their apartment? I feel like I would have that in my apartment, so I don't know why I'm judging, but this is why I'm leaning towards this being Mark in particular, because he ends up becoming a Scarecrow later on as the person without a brain archetype. But I digress. We're moving on. Danny is like, I hope I'm not ruining your plans. And Josh is like, no, you're definitely not. And you can definitely see that he's lying. And Mark can't even like look at her in the face. And he has his crazy eyebrows going because this specific actor is the one with the crazy eyebrows. But Pele is like so into it. And you can see that like Christian's just like bear hugging Danny in this mirror. Oh, we'll get more of that later. Anyway, Mark ends up deflecting and asks Christian to come take a look at his paper in the other room, and he almost forgets his laptop, which like wasn't even really open. He takes Christian into another room, and Danny ends up coming down, sitting amongst the remaining two, Pele and Josh. The two of them begin talking. We see that Pele is drawing. And in this conversation, we learned that Danny had to take the rest of the year off, given what happened. The two of them have this like really nice back and forth. And Pele tries to get Josh into the conversation, but he's like, no, and gets up to microwave his coffee. Like we can see that Christian's friends hate Danny's guts, which is insane because she did nothing. She did nothing. But we see that Danny ends up mentioning that they will be arriving on her birthday, and Pele makes a joke, and like for the first time in the entire movie, we see her smile and laugh. And this is like, at this point, we're like 30 minutes into this movie, maybe 45 minutes into this movie. This is a 2.5 hour movie, and it takes a while before we get to the actual horror elements. You know, the two of them talk about the festival, and Pele shows Danny previous year's celebration as well as the May Queen. And Pele like pointedly stares at Danny and says that he's really happy she's coming. Throughout this conversation, we get to see more of the apartment and how like kind of dingy it is. We also get to see a little Paddington bear on the windowsill. So that's a fun little background moment that I'm sure does not come up in any way later on. Pele ends up bringing up her loss and is like, I'm so sorry for your loss. And we see an immediate shift in Danny's demeanor as she begins to have a breakdown and is like, sorry, I have to. And then she runs away and goes to the bathroom in this apartment. But suddenly it's the plain bathroom. As she like crosses the threshold, she opens it into the plain bathroom. And we see that Danny is breaking down in this plain bathroom, and she's grasping at her mouth so no one can hear her like scream and cry. And we learn that anything that has to do with family is a trigger for her. Is something that like will immediately set her off and cause her to have a little mentee bee. She returns to her seat with Christian, and we are like consumed with this bright light coming through the window. As we zoom out into that bright light, we see the clouds over Sweden, and the plane hits turbulence. Another little moment of foreshadowing. In the car, they travel up to Hälsingland, and Mark makes these incredibly misogynistic comments about three women just like standing on the side of the road. And it's like, why is everyone here just like so beautiful? And Josh brings up the fact that the Vikings stole the most beautiful women of other nations. And again, feels a little pointed once you've watched this movie a couple of times, because, I mean, essentially that's what happens to Danny. And in this conversation, we learn that it's a 4-hour drive. And in one of the best shots of this movie, we track the car through the countryside before the camera flips and follows them from the front. It's so disorienting. And it's like, it feels like we're going through the looking glass, which is another thing about the mirrors, is that it kind of is a reference to Alice in Wonderland. There is a sign that they pass under about Helsingland, and I had to do a little research as to what this translated to. But the sign ends up translating to "Stop mass immigration to Helsingland. Vote Free North this fall." And Free North is a hard right, conservative, fascist group, or at least a fictional one, in this movie. And that's where we get the uncomfortable moments of the modern day in this movie, isn't it? For anyone who is listening, this movie is essentially about a white supremacist fascist cult. So it's, once you like understand that, it kind of like sours. It sours Danny's like happy ending, that cathartic ending that you feel, because she has been inducted into this far right fascist cult. And we see this now. This is in comparison to our last two movies coming out in the 70s, or I guess in the 80s. This one is very recent, and so it definitely like hits the pulse a little bit more. It was created during the last Trump presidency, and it is in direct conversation, I think, with the rise of fascism in this country, which is quite a fun thing to be talking about. I know. I'm sure that you're having fun with me talking about this, but we see that the Harga itself definitely did not put up this sign. This sign is just kind of there for the town that they are going to, that they will eventually then get to the Harga commune, but it definitely starts laying out the idea that we are going to be seeing some aspects of white supremacy in this movie. In a way, it's very underlying. It's an underlying current within this movie. Though once you start thinking about it, you start seeing it more and more. And that is also why I wanted to bring up the Greek chorus. One of the tools of white supremacy has always been the classics. And when I say the classics, I don't mean like Moby Dick. I'm talking about ancient Greek, ancient Roman society. This is something that, the Victorians did. These beautiful, beautiful ancient statues used to have paint on them, but, the Victorians wanted it to be these perfect white statues. And so they removed the paint to uphold white supremacist beliefs. They'll use ancient Greek philosophy to prove that white people are the superior race, quote unquote. And it's obviously far, far right beliefs. It's something that we see MAGA often coming back to, is these philosophical things being said by the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, even though it's definitely, there are mistranslations, there is bias in those translating, especially, classics as a academic field has always kind of been fueled by this white supremacist thinking. Though in the modern day, we definitely we've seen it move away from that, and we want to like actually understand what the ancients were saying and what we're talking about and they were worshiping, what their everyday was, and actually get to understand them as a people versus mapping their philosophies or mismapping their philosophies in order to uphold white supremacist beliefs. I'm going to stop now. I'm sure I'll talk about it a little bit more as we go through, but let's continue with the movie. The group pulls up to a field where others seem to be gathering, and there are other Harga, like Pele, returning to this village. Pele introduces them to a few people, a man screams, and we learn that this is his brother, Ingmar, and they use brother and sister like Jehovah's Witnesses use brother and sister, where it's just someone else in the congregation. According to Jehovah's Witnesses, we are all brothers and sisters under Christ, so, it's the same thing. Ingmar introduces them to two other outsiders, their names being Simon and Connie, and they're from London. Ingmar ends up bringing out mushrooms, and they go to take it, but Danny wants to wait a little bit, gain her bearings. She pulls Christian aside to say this. And Christian says that he'll wait with her, but she insists. She's like, "No, you go do it." And Christian's like, "No, I'll wait for you, and we'll do it together." And Mark is all like, "What the fuck? Like, we can't have separate trips." And Danny ends up giving in. Ingmar does offer her mushroom tea instead, because it's supposed to help with the taste. And I do want to say, while in this most recent viewing of Midsommar, I do find Christian's character to be slightly more sympathetic than every other time that I've seen this. I think it helps that I had, listened to quite a lot of podcasts and like done a lot of reading in preparation for this recording, and just being able to like hear other people's views on this character, I think helped soften my hatred for Christian. Like, I still hate him. I hate his guts. But, you do see moments that he does seem to be a little genuine. And I think that this is one of those moments where he's being a little genuine and is like actually thinking about Danny's well-being. And instead we see Mark, his friend, kind of doing the pushing against Danny versus him, which I think is a very interesting thing to think about when it comes to peer pressure. Don't do drugs, kids. Dare. We only had Dare in school till I was in like 5th or 6th grade, and then they got rid of the Dare program. So, fun. So we cut over to the group in a field tripping, and we learn that it's 9 p.m. and it's still bright daylight out. And Mark is like freaking out. He's like, "Why is it still light?" And another person walks by and he's like, "I don't want new people here. Oh my God." And Pele's like, "New people are good, Mark." And like Pele is just like really calm and relaxed in this trip. And Danny is like breathing intensely as Pele talks about like the energy of the earth and everything existing in harmony. And we see that like grass seems to be growing out of Danny's hand. And that the trees are breathing. And Danny does seem to be a little serene in this moment, but Mark calls all of them his family, and that immediately snaps Danny out of her high, and she like runs away. She's like, "I gotta go." And as she's walking away, she encounters a group laughing, and she like freaks out, and Ingmar ends up like running into her. And he says hi, and she's like, "They were laughing at me." And he reassures her that they were laughing for like the last hour and that they're just high. And Danny just like abruptly leaves the convo and runs to an outhouse where she like, this is fucked up and freaky and scary. But she lights a match, and in her reflection, we see her sister in the gas mask. And so does Danny. Danny sees her. She freaks out and runs into the woods, and we cut to black. Danny is obviously having a dream now, and we see these like red and blue flashing lights. We see Danny's family sitting in the dark on a couch watching a movie, and Danny wakes up. We find her sleeping on the ground in a field. It might be the woods. It's probably like just into the trees before it becomes thick forest. Christian wakes up Danny and lets her know that she's been like passed out for 6 hours. And she's like, "Did it get dark at all?" And he's like, "For a couple hours, but not completely." And Danny's like, "Is it tomorrow?" And technically, yes, it is tomorrow. Christian helps Danny up and they trek to the woods to the Harga commune. And I wanted to digress really quickly, as I tend to do. So I had studied abroad in 2019, before this movie had come out in May. Well, I was studying abroad in May. This movie, I believe, came out in June or July. And I studied abroad in Ireland. And that was the one thing that, like, freaked me out about, studying abroad in a country that I've never visited before during the summer, is that, like, the sun didn't set till like 10 p.m. and the sun rose at like 5 a.m. And it wasn't even close to the middle of the summer. So that, like, having it just kind of be daylight for a lot of the time was something that, like, really fucked up the sleep schedule. So I imagine this fucking with them. But cutting back to the movie, we get an overhead shot and, like, this whimsical music as they trek through the woods. Mark ends up making a comment about ticks, and there's this, like, little conversation between, like, him, Josh, and Pelle about, like, ticks being a problem in Sweden. And this is a joke because Ari Aster is so afraid of ticks, and that's something that he was freaking out about while filming in Hungary. Thank you for incorporating your fears, Mr. Aster. Please stop. I have to beg you to stop. This is getting to be too much. These movies are so intense. Please. Anyway, the group enters the commune through, like, this geometric sun portal. Again, it's very much giving Alice in Wonderland through the looking glass. They are welcomed by flute players, and those who are already part of the Harga go and greet their loved ones. It is a very peaceful and tranquil set. As we, like, pan through this community, we see the maypole. Everyone in the group is given, like, these snacks, and Pelle introduces the group to his sister, quote unquote, and Father Odd. Father Odd welcomes everyone, but he particularly welcomes Danny home, quote unquote. He talks about his frock and how it is supposed to symbolize the hermaphroditic nature of nature. And Josh ends up going on this, like, anthropological side note. The music swells once again, and we get sweeping views of the village and different celebrations. We pull over to a stage area where the village elders sit, and a woman who this woman will later know as Siv, welcomes the village and the outsiders to the Harga and the Midsummer Festival. She introduces that this is particularly special because it is a part of the 90-year feast concept, and she welcomes it as the hottest summer on record, and that this is a particularly good thing, and everyone cheers. And once again, prescient to these times, this was filmed in 2018, comes out in 2019, and every summer since has just been the hottest on record. It's just been hotter and hotter. And I imagine this summer is going to be even hotter, and every summer for the rest of our lives are going to be the hottest summer on record. Thank you, global warming. Thank you for the Trump administration. I love living here. Anyway, we continue on. There's this brief shot of a child with, I think, elephantitis, and this wig. Once again, we're on wigs. We're talking about wigs, people. Oh, I cut through that. I'm so sorry, everyone. I'm going to try and fix that in post. But wigs, once again. This is the only character with, like, a wig that I want to talk about, because what is that bang? It's so geometric. It's giving that scene in Fleabag where Fleabag and her sister are talking about her sister's new haircut, and Fleabag has to be like, "It's French, Claire. It's French." We cut back over and we see that Siv hands a torch to an older woman and an older man. And I do have to say that this older woman kind of looks like Danny, which I think is an interesting point, because we are never getting a sequel to Midsommar, so we'll never get to see Danny's 72nd/73rd birthday, where it's time for her to participate in the Arastupa. So in a sense, it kind of has this, like, weird time travel effect to it, where we get to see like someone, they grab onto these torches and the woman yells at the sky. We cut over and we see a redheaded girl getting ready in the mirror as drums beat. She does the Harga exhale and inhales rapidly. I don't know if you can hear that on this recording. I guess we'll see. Outside, we see a group of Harga in line celebrating. As the group looks on, they're playing a game called Skin the Fool, which each of these individual celebrations kind of predicts the outcome of each of these characters. So this one in particular predicts the outcome of Mark. The group, and when I say the group, I mean Josh, Mark, Christian, Danny, Simon, Connie, as well as Pele and Ingmar, are kind of in conversation. And Connie and Simon are talking, and you can like tell that Ingmar hates Simon. They're all sitting on the ground, and the redheaded girl comes up and kicks Christian. He looks at her, and Danny's literally sitting there. She's like, really? In front of my salad? But before Christian goes to join, he's like, can anyone join? And Pele's like, you're an American, just jam yourself in there. So Christian leaves, and Pele gives Danny a drawing of her as the May Queen as a gift for her birthday. And Danny genuinely smiles again, and she's like, thank you, Pele. And we learned that Christian had completely forgotten her birthday. And Pele's like, oh, no. And Danny's like, oh, I forgot to remind him. And if you have to remind someone when your birthday is, fuck them. And this is coming from someone who genuinely forgets when people's birthday are. It's a lot to remember dates. But I will still tell people happy birthday. I will remember it suddenly and be like, oh my God, it's your birthday. Let me send a text. Let me give you a call. I unfortunately forgot my little sister's birthday last year, and it is something that she has not let me live down since. And so every time I see her now, I tell her happy birthday, and I think for her birthday, she's not listening to this, but for her birthday this year, I think I'm going to call the entire week leading up to her birthday, telling her happy birthday, just to be annoying, because I get to be an annoying older brother. We cut to another scene, and the group walks through the village as Pele shows them around. And Josh is asking him questions about, the culture. We see a group of children carving runes, and we learn that the Harga make their money through homeopathics, linen, lumber, among other things. We learned that the children put these runes under the pillows to dream of their powers. This is foreshadowing for what happens between Maya and Christian later. They come across a large slab in the ground with a bunch of runes carved on it, and Josh is like, oh, is this the younger Futhark? But he's corrected, and it's actually the elder Futhark. For any Swedish listeners who may be out there, I do not know the difference. So please sound out in the comments, and let me know the difference between the younger and elder Futhark. But as, Pele and Josh are having this conversation, Connie and Simon are talking to Danny and Christian, and Connie asks Danny and Christian how long they've been together, and this is where we learn that they've been together for 4 years. And everything else in this movie suggests that they had maybe been together for like a year, that they were kind of like just dating, but they've been together for 4 years. But Christian says that they've been together for 3.5. And Danny has to be like, no. We got together around my birthday. Christian deflects and asks how Simon and Connie met Ingmar. And Ingmar tells them that they were all working together on the same farm, and that he had dated Connie when Simon and him became friends. And Connie's like, no, that's not what happened. Like, I didn't even realize it was a date. This is the reason why we can see Ingmar hate Simon. We also learn that the two of them are engaged. And Danny turns around and is all like, what? And you can see Christian be a little uncomfortable with that. Simon jokes that Ingmar will officiate the wedding. No, not really. And we can tell that like there is this like mutual hatred between Simon and Ingmar. Christian ends up pointing out a large triangular structure in the distance, and we learn that it is a sacred temple that no one is allowed in. It is at this point that the group kind of splits up into their like Ingmar group and Pele group, and Simon points out a large bear in a cage and is like, are we not going to talk about the bear in a cage? And Ingmar's like, it's a bear. What is there to point out? It's a bear. Put that in your back pocket for later. And Connie points out a large tapestry mural that you read from right to left, which immediately makes you uncomfortable because in the Western world, we read from left to right. Even in comics, we read from left to right, even though, in other countries, they do not. And in this large tapestry mural, in this large, I'm going to call it a comic, it shows a girl in love with a boy. She walks backward through a field of flowers, picking them, placing them under her pillow, and dreams about the two of them falling in love. The next morning, the cock crows. We see the girl cutting off her pubes and putting them in a pot for cooking and bleeding into a cup. She gives the boy the food. The boy is hypnotized and falls in love with the girl, now pregnant. Ingmar particularly calls this a love story. Put this in your back pocket because we will be talking about it later, or I guess throughout the movie, because it's a very slow occurrence. Pele shows the group where they will be sleeping. It is this large open floor plan building with many beds, as well as it's covered in painted murals, and I'll bring up them as we get closer shots of them. It's in this part that we get the Seasons of Life monologue, where we learn that at 36 you move into the laborer's house. So each part of your life you move into a different house. This part is for the summer people, for those in this summer of your life. So we learn that child to 18, you are in the spring of your life. And from 18 to 36, you are in the summer of your life, and you go on pilgrimage to other parts of the world. And from 36 to 55, you are in the fall of your life, and you are a laborer. Between 54 and 72, you are a mentor, and you are in the winter of your life. Danny asks what happens after 72, and Pele mimics, he cuts his throat and mimics death after 72, and everyone kind of is like, oh, Pele, you're so funny. Put that in your back pocket for later. Danny ends up finding the wall of prior May Queens and is kind of looking at all of them. And Pele takes Christian to the side and tells him that he forgot Danny's birthday. We learn that the May Queens are chosen through a dance competition. And as they're talking about it, a woman, Inga, interrupts, letting Pele know that the kids are watching Austin Powers. She and Mark make eyes at each other. Christian pulls Danny outside to then surprise her with a cake and candle that had been provided by Pele. As this next scene happens, there is just a group of 3 women cradling a baby who is crying. And this crying baby will be in the rest of the movie. We will hear this crying over and over and over and over again, which sets me off personally. There's nothing worse than a crying baby. I mean, that's a hyperbole. There are obviously things worse than a crying baby. But still, Christian, has a hard time lighting the candle, and he eventually gets it lit, and Christian makes excuses for forgetting her birthday, and Danny's like, it's fine, it's fine. We cut to a shot where sunset breaks across the Harga village. Once again, the baby's crying as everyone prepares for bed. Pele mentions that tomorrow's a big day and the first of the festivities, and Josh is like, well, what is it? And Pele says that it is the Ata Stupa, which is a mythical tradition, Nordic tradition. It's one of those things where it's said to happen, but it is probably just Roman white supremacist nonsense. Josh reacts. Josh is like, oh, a real one? And everyone else is like, well, what is that? And Josh refuses to tell everyone. Christian's like, what is it? And Danny, smiles quizzically, and it's like, she asks if it's scary. He refuses to tell her. He kind of just smiles at her, which is insane because they all knew what happened to Danny's parents and to her sister. Josh knew. Josh could have and should have warned Danny, but he didn't because he's a piece of shit. Christian ends up trying to Google what an Ata Stupa is, but we learn that there is no cell service. Cut to one of our only night scenes. The baby's crying, and Danny wakes up, staring at an image of a girl cutting open her hands to bleed on the ground where sunflowers grow, and she is flanked by 2 people. And there's a creepy sun smiling down at them. Later, we get to see this mural in a larger context, and we see that it's not just 2 people that this woman is flanked by, but it's a lot of people. And this is the Ada Stupa. Cut to the next morning and the start of the celebration. Women are singing and they're playing with large cloths. Children are running around. And we learn that these vocalizations are from a woman leading what kind of looks like a yoga class. Or I guess what a Nordic version of yoga is. There is a table set in the shape of a rune, and everyone gathers for a meal in front of the yellow structure. There is a group of girls walking backwards and picking flowers, and Mark makes a comment about them walking stupid and someone should tell them. Everyone is kind of just standing there, and Pele has to explain that everyone stands until it is right to sit. And Danny joins the group because she was with those girls walking backwards and picking flowers, and she gives Christian the flowers. A young child rings a bell, and the two elders from earlier are wearing gray frocks, and they join the group at the head of the table. We pan back over to our group, and Josh asks Pele if they're the ones TM, and Pele's like, yeah. And the setup of this table is that everyone sits on one side of it, so it very much looks like the Last Supper, where everyone just kind of sits at one side of the table. Well, everyone sits down and everyone waits to eat until the elders begin to eat. And once the elders start eating, everyone else kind of does, and Mark makes a comment like, this food is inedible. And you look at it and it is kind of inedible. It kind of just looks like flowers were set on a plate. It's not real food. At this table, we see Maya carving the redheaded girl, Maya, carving a rune at the table. Danny talks to another woman about the little baby that has been crying, and we see that Danny is actually really good with the baby. She's is like, oh, you want this? And she's talking to the baby. Everyone stops eating when the two stop eating, and they stand up and they do a little ritual, and they do the Harga breath thing. Danny is captivated by this, by the way. Siv stands up and raises a toast to everyone, but then the two elder Harga in the gray do a little does a lot of eye speaking to each other as they toast these last moments together, being like, we made it this far, we can do it. We then see some dark robed Harga come in and lift the two on chairs and take them to a second location. As they are brought to a second location and everyone else kind of follows behind, Mark breaks away from the group to go take a nap. We cut over to these bright chalk cliffs, and all the Harga and the group stand at the bottom looking up, and we see that one of them is holding a mallet. Danny, Josh, and Christian and Pele stand off to the side, and everyone else kind of stands in another group. The dark-robed Harga carry the chairs to the top of the cliff, and in this sequence, we see that there are a lot of large stone ruins that line the cliffside, like gravestones. A horn sounds, and Josh breaks away to stand closer to Pele because they kind of gave each other space, and asks about a large book that Siv is holding and reading from. It's called the Ruby Rotter, and that is their scripture. Josh is like, can I read that? And Pele's like, you would not be able to. Cut back up to the two at the top of the cliff. They offer their palms to be sliced open, and then they wipe their blood on these large runes that, presumably have their names on it as a kind of we were here moment. Danny looks up cautiously, anticipating, and you can see in her eyes that she kind of already knows what's going to happen. The woman stands at the edge, gestures to the sky, and she jumps. Danny grasps at Christian's arm, and we see the gore of the woman bouncing off the rocks. Her face just completely caved in, and everything becomes muted as Danny dissociates from the entire situation. Connie and Simon freak out in the background. We can't hear a lot of it because of the muffled nature of the disassociation. Simon's like, you're fucked, you're all fucked, oh my god, what happened? The two of them are being American tourists, even though they're British. Though I've heard that recently that British tourists are worse than American tourists, in the way that they destroy the streets of other cities. Someone confirm that for me, if you're listening. Because I don't know, I've kind of always heard that American tourists are the worst tourists, and it's something to be cautious of and mindful of as American tourists. It's now the man's turn, and the outsiders, our group, wince and gag. Danny just stares. The man does his little expelling his life force ritual, and then pencil jumps off the cliff, breaking his legs, and he's still alive. The Harga begin to moan and scream in pain with him, and, at this point, we don't understand that the Harga share each other's emotions. They share each other's celebrations, their pain, their sorrow. But so it's a very disorienting moment to have the entire group just kind of like scream with him. Enter the person with the hammer, and there's 4 people that I think are supposed to be his family, this man's family. They bring this hammer down on his head, and we get close-up shots fully of this watermelon breaking. Simon makes a big, big, big deal of this, and Siv has to explain to them that this is a long observed custom, and it is an honor for them to do. That children, unbirthed children, that's a weird phrase, but will be named after them, and it's all about the cycle of life. And in a very pointed moment, she looks directly at Danny and says, "It does no good dying," lashing back at the inevitable. It corrupts the spirit. And Ingmar tells Connie and Simon, "Oops, sorry I didn't warn you better, teehee." Everyone returns to the main camp, and Christian's like, "Are you okay?" And another, actually, I think, true moment between the two of them. Christian asks if Danny is okay, and Danny has to be like, "No, I just really need to not be here right now." And if you've ever been on Twitter or online, you have seen this specific gif of Danny as she breaks off from the group and walks away crying before fully sobbing and breaking down, whereas she's holding it back and she's walking and she has that frowny face. You know exactly the gif I'm talking about. Christian finds Josh back in the sleeping quarters. Josh booked it back, and Josh is immediately writing everything that has happened down. It's in this moment that Christian tells Josh that he is doing his thesis on the Harga, and they get into a fight about it. And honestly, if I was doing a PhD and someone was doing the same topic as me, I think I'd be a little pissed too. I don't think I would be the same amount of pissed that Josh was, because at the end of the day, he's doing it on the Midsommar traditions, and it includes the Harga, but Christian just kind of wants to do it on the Harga. So it's technically 2 different theses, but I digress. Josh dresses him down, fully, reads him to filth. As they're doing this whole thing, we see one of the paintings on the walls seems to be naked people dancing around a fire. And we'll see that in full later. Christian is like, "I'm open to collaborating." We cut away, and we don't cut away, but Christian walks out, and outside Mark is like, "Bruh, you couldn't have woken me up? Anything I wanted to see." But Connie and Simon are still freaking out, and they're like, "We're leaving." And they're packing their stuff. Josh ends up angrily involving Pele in the Christian drama, and Pele is like, "Y'all can't do your thesis on this anyway, the elders wouldn't approve." And Josh fights back, and Pele's like, "Christian asked me to do it first, so if you were allowed to anyway, Christian asked first." Pele ends up being like, "Fine, I'll ask the elders." I don't think he ever actually ends up asking the elders, or if he does, it's this is how we're gonna kill them. We also cut over to Danny packing her things alone, and she's kind of crying, and Pele comes in and is very apologetic to Danny about the incident, and he also knew what was going to happen, so I think he's also kind of an asshole for not telling Danny, but he kind of has this Swedish charm to him that makes it a little better. But I digress. He shouldn't have that much charm. Actually, you know what? I'm going back on that. He's an asshole. Fuck Pele. Danny is just kind of repeating, "I don't know why I'm here. Why you invited us?" And she's freaking out, and she's crying. She's not crying. She's holding it back. Pele is like, "I wanted to invite my friends because I thought they'd appreciate it." And Danny is like, "I'm not an anthropologist. I don't understand any of this." To which Pele's like, I was most excited for you to come. And he offers her like this stone to smell. And she's like, no, I don't want anything. And he takes like a big whiff from it. Do I know what it does? No, it's more drugs. Pele's like, I know what you're going through. I lost my parents in a fire. And Danny's like, what am I even going through? And they're like talking over each other. And this is also like the first time that she's cried in front of another person, which is a big moment for her because she is someone who bottles up her emotions to deal with alone. And as a fellow Cancer, I relate. Unfortunately, don't look at me too hard, please, or I'll cry. Pele is like, I belong to this community. I have a family. I have always felt held by a family, a real family, which everyone deserves. And you deserve, Danny. Pele, like, grasps Danny's hand, and Danny's like, whoa, Christian can walk in. And he's like, I'm talking about him. I'm talking about that motherfucker. He says, and this is such a, line. He goes, he's my good friend, and I like him, but Danny, do you feel held by him? Does he feel like home to you? And they, like, stare at each other tensely in the eyes. And you can see that, like, Danny is finally contemplating this relationship that the two of them have, and quite possibly like beginning to fall for Pele, or it's maybe not beginning because there was the entire thing with the birthday sketch, but same thing. We cut over to the two dead Harga getting rolled onto a fire, and everyone kind of like stands around and does a like little ritual and like to release them into the world. There's like this fade out, and we see Danny sitting in a field, and Christian comes up to check on her. And Danny's like, are you not absurd? Are you not disturbed by this? And he's like, yeah, of course I am. But he's like kind of talking to her like a child in this moment. But he does make a good point that they probably find it disturbing that we put our elderly in homes to just kind of like rot away. And Danny kind of gives him like this serious eye roll for not like commiserating with her, because that's all she really wants. She wants someone to like validate her emotions. And Christian's like, well, think of it this way. Instead of being like, yeah, that's fucked up, we should talk about why it's fucked up. But I also wanted to talk about this part because the fact that the Harga essentially kill I know it's more of a commit suicide, but because it's a religious thing, it's a cult. I'm going to call it killing, because once they kill their elderly, is part of white supremacist ideals. It's part of fascist ideals. Once you are no longer useful to the system, it is time for you to be killed. We saw that, any historian will tell you that as being one of the precursors to the Holocaust and one of the main tenets of Nazism. But, that is... I just wanted to bring up that like the uncaring nature for the elderly is part of white supremacy, and I just wanted to bring that up. We cut back to nighttime in the sleeping hall, and Danny asks Josh for a sleeping pill, and she takes that sleeping pill, but she wakes up in the middle of the night after hearing a noise, and it sounds like Christian going, shh, don't wake her, and him, Josh, and Mark all sneaking out in the middle of the night. Danny, like, walks out to find them in a car, leaving her behind with the Harga. Danny opens her mouth, and black smoke pours out of it. We get flashes of her dead parents, and the two Harga. We see that Danny sees her parents at the bottom of the cliff with her sister with the gas tube still on, and we understand that it's a dream, like with all the flashing. We cut away from the dream, it's still nighttime, and we see that Maya is holding the rune that she was carving earlier, and she places it under Christian's bed, and Josh, who isn't asleep, sees what's happening with this. We cut to a mural of the maypole dance surrounded by smaller pictures of people having sex. Once again, foreshadowing for later. I don't have to interpret this one too much. Back to daytime, the Harga collect the ashes of the two and sing as they toss the remains onto this dead tree in the background. Pele is gardening something as a group of Harga demolish a wooden effigy of a donkey. Like they bring a hammer down on like this donkey looking figure and this horse, and then they all silently clap. Between the gardening and this like ritual with the wooden donkey horse thing, and the fact that Mark and Josh come over immediately after, this is foreshadowing for what happens to Josh. Especially because that donkey horse thing just kind of like collapses into a million pieces. And we see that Josh is also in pieces later on. But Mark and Josh come over, and Josh is like, any word on what the elders say? And Pele gives him the rules as to how he can write about the Harga. Pele knows that Josh is dying, so it doesn't matter at the end of the day. Mark ends up leaving it to take a piss, and Josh shows Pele the rune that Maya left, and Pele calls it a love rune. Christian comes over, and Pele tells Christian the news about their thesi, and Christian's like overjoyed about it. Pele does end up mentioning that Maya like has taken a liking to Christian, and Christian's like, oh, really? And like looks around for her. Pele also explains that she has just been approved to have sex last year. It's in this moment that we learn that Maya's only like 15, 16 years old, which according to Swedish law is age of consent. You know, we had this conversation around the same time as Midsommar when Call Me By Your Name came out, and we were talking about, you know, what the age of consent in Italy. But it's, you know, Christian is into banging this teenager when, you know, he's doing his PhD, which means he's probably like 29, 30 years old. Disgusting. If that doesn't give you a reason to hate him, there's another reason to hate him. In the background, this is cut off by a man like freaking the fuck out. We'll learn that his name is Ulf, and he runs over, and we see that Mark is peeing on the dead tree from earlier that they put the two Harga's ashes on, and Mark is like, what did I do? And this man is yelling at him in Swedish, and Pele is like trying to keep peace, and like Pele tells Mark about the tree, that it's the ancestral tree, and Mark is like, so what? Like, I just had to take a piss. Like, it doesn't matter anyway. And Pele has to be like, it's important to us. And this is where we get another dichotomy between us and you. You, the outsider, and us. Ulf ends up collapsing to the ground, crying. We cut over to see Connie kind of like walking around worriedly. She has her packs on. She runs into the sleeping room where she finds Danny. And she's like, we're leaving, actually. But Father Odd comes over and informs Connie that a man named Jan... There are so many names for these Harga people. A man named Jan and Simon had driven to the station, but that he'll be waiting there for her. And the truck will be coming back for her. And she's understandably like, what the actual fuck? And Father Odd is like, well, the truck only fits two, and the time that it takes to get to the station is a certain amount of time, and between having to go there and back, the train out of Hälsingland would have gone by and you would have missed your train and you would have been standing there. Danny's kind of like eavesdropping and coming out. Not quite eavesdropping, because she's like standing there. And Connie is just like exasperated. She's like, he would never do that. But after Connie leaves, Father Odd tells Danny that lunch is in a bit. And this is the midpoint of the movie, by the way. We have hit the midpoint. This is a long, long movie. We cut over to Christian interviewing Harga about how roles are assigned. Who does the gardening, who does the cleaning, who does the livestock, etc., etc. And this Harga man says that it's based on traits that they show as kids. Danny comes over to find Christian and inform him that Simon had left Connie behind, and how weird that is. But Christian's like, oh no. Anyway, and begins to talk to the Harga and asks if incest is a problem in their community. And the Harga is like, no, incest, we do not do incest. You must get approval by the elders as to who can mate and produce offspring. And we like see Danny be like, bitch, what the fuck? You're ignoring me, and now you're talking to this random Harga about incest? Like, what the fuck is happening? The wind picks up, and we see that Josh is being escorted into like this dark, oddly shaped, like German expressionist building. Danny ends up stumbling up to the kitchen, and one of the Harga women asks if she wants to help make lunch, and Danny is like, yeah, sure. She asks them about Simon, and, all the Harga have their stories lined up. There's no denying. No one's going to say something that another person is going to contradict. You know what I mean? Danny also learns that they're making meat pies. We're back to the meat pies, people. When I was putting this together, I did not realize that I had scheduled 2 meat pie related content into this section of the podcast, but I hope you all enjoy it. But yes, we are learning that they're making meat tarts that are presumably not made of people, though we never get confirmation about that. But anyway, behind them, Maya is making a very special meat tart. And we'll learn why it's a special meat tart later. We cut back to see Josh and an elder looking at the ruby rotter. And it is described as emotional sheet music, and that each runic letter stands for one of 16 affects, graded from most holy to most unholy. And the elder is like flipping through the pages of these runic letters, and some are covered completely with paint, and in the back it is left completely blank. And it is described as forever a work in progress, and that there are many hundreds of these books, and we see these books lining the walls of this sacred temple. This specific iteration is written by Ruben, the boy with elephantitis, the boy with disabilities from earlier. The elder says that his disability means that he is unclouded by regular human thoughts, and it leaves him open to messages. And that we learn that Ruben was a deliberate product of inbreeding, and all of their oracles are a deliberate product of inbreeding, which is a contradictory statement from earlier with Christian. But this, there has also been discussion as to whether or not this is there is a specific trope that comes with, people with disabilities containing some sort of magic or some sort of second sight in movies. And I want to hear more in the comments. Please comment below and let me know what your thoughts are about Ruben. I kind of see it as particularly about whether or not this is an okay portrayal. I think because by the end of the movie we are supposed to realize that the Harga are not good people, that we are supposed to feel sorry for Ruben as a character. And we also learned that none of the magic, quote unquote, in this community is real. It's all just kind of drug-related nonsense. So I'm a little back and forth on it. I'd love to hear in the comments what other people think about it. But we cut back to Danny taking pies out of the oven, and faintly in the background, we hear the sound of a woman screaming. We also cut over to Mark kind of fucking around outside of the yellow structure as the Harga fill it with many things. And we also hear a woman scream from his perspective. Inga ends up exiting the yellow structure and waves at Mark, and Mark doesn't seem like he wholly wants to see her, but maybe he does. There's a little bit of a complication in this Inga-Mark relationship. We zoom out as a young child comes up to Mark and speaks at him in Swedish. We cut back to the dinner table as the remaining group sits uncomfortably. And because everything's perfectly lined up and perfectly symmetrical, we see that Christian's drink is noticeably redder than everyone else's. The meat pies are delivered one by one, and the woman handing out the meat pies gives Christian a look TM. Danny ends up asking Pele if anyone had seen Connie, and Mark says that he had seen her, and it looked like she was running for the Olympics. A random Harga also butts in and is like, apparently Simon called from the station to calm her down, and she pardoned herself and left. I think as an audience member, we know that this is false. There's something screwy about that. Danny is still I just don't understand why Simon would leave without her. And Christian's like, I'm sure it was just a miscommunication, duh. And Danny is bewildered by this comment. And everyone is supposed to wait for someone else to begin eating. We saw this earlier, but Danny kind of takes a little piece off of her pie and bites on it, and she responds by saying, I could see you possibly doing that. And she says that to Christian. And Christian's like, what the fuck? And Pele's face is like, oh yeah, I've got her now. It's only a matter of time. Mark and Josh are, like, not paying attention to this conversation, but Mark leans over to Josh and makes a comment about, like, Ulf staring daggers at him from across the table, and is like, dude, is he gonna kill me? The answer is yes. The answer is yes, he's going to kill him. But Josh just is not paying attention to anything. He's got nothing out of the last 5 minutes of the convo. He leans over to Christian and is like, did you see anything from the Ruby Rotter? And Christian's like, what the fuck, times two? Josh ends up, like, snapping back at him and is like, just forget I ever said anything. And in this moment, like, you can see Christian realizing that he has lost his friends and his girlfriend, that he no longer has control over anyone in his circle. And he's, like, angry about it. And still, everyone's not eating. Like, Danny just took, like, a little, like, piece of the crust off. But Christian decides to take a large bite from his pie. And after chewing, he pulls a red-haired pube from his mouth. After he appropriately freaks out, Christian stares at Maya, and Maya stares at him back, and Danny is just kind of, like, in the middle. Like, really? Right in front of my salad? Again? Everyone else is like, dude, what the fuck? That's so gross. And Christian's like, oh well, and takes a big swig of his red-colored drink. We cut over, and we see Josh's notes on the many symbols. You can't, like, discern much of it. I don't know if it was just, like, the way it was filmed or whatever. Like, trying to read his writing was hard. But one of the symbols we do see is a triangle with a square in it, and it looks like the large yellow structure. Mark continues to be freaked out, and Inga butts in and is like, Mark, will you come with me? I'll show you. And Mark is like, I'm gonna go. She wants to show me. And he leaves, and this is the last we ever see of Mark. Zoom in on Josh's face, and we cut over to him now in the sleeping area, and it's dark, and Danny comes back over and asks for another sleeping pill. Josh looks around nervous, but gives her the sleeping pill, and he goes to bed. And in this case, we see that he is still wearing his shoes to bed, because he is up to some nonsense. While everyone else is sleeping, he sneaks out in this, like, morning dusk, this late night dusk. Like, it's hard to tell the time in this moment. But he enters that holy structure from earlier. It's darkly lit inside, but, like, there's this spotlight on the Ruby Rotter, and he begins to take pictures of the book with his flash on, like a dumbass. And the camera pans up to a window that is directly in front of him. And in the reflection of the window, we see the front door open and someone approaches Josh from behind. Josh, seeing the reflection, whips around and thinks it's Mark. But this is actually Ulf wearing Mark's entire face and hair as a mask, kind of like Michael Myers in Halloween. That's very much what it's giving. Another podcast mentioned this. I can't seem to figure out if it's real or not, but, like, apparently, Ulf is also wearing Mark's penis on his penis, like a sleeve, which is a choice. As we see, Ulf as Mark, we see that Ruben is literally in a corner watching this happen, lying on a cot. Poor Ruben. Ruben deserves better. Another person ends up sneaking up behind Josh and hitting him over the head with a hammer. This is Pele. Josh falls to the ground, he's groaning, he's dying, and then he is, like, dragged away. The next morning, everyone is woken up by a trumpet, and we focus on Josh's empty bed. At breakfast, the seating has changed. Now everyone is facing each other like a normal dining table. It is no longer the Last Supper, probably because the last of the outsiders have been killed. At least that's my interpretation. But Danny asks Christian if he thinks Mark is still with Inga because he hasn't shown up. He didn't show up for bed last night, and he's not there this morning. And Pele responds instead, being like, yeah, probably. Danny also wonders about Josh, and Christian's like, I'm honestly not too concerned. Like, Jesus, God. Like, why are you so concerned about my friends? One of the elders stands up and addresses everyone, stating that the Ruby Rotter was stolen the night prior. And as they line up to return their dishes after breakfast, two of the elders walk up to what remains of the group, so Danny and Christian and Pele. And Christian is, like, freaking out, and he's like, I don't know where Josh is. And the elders are like, well, your two friends disappeared the same day, and so did our holy scriptures, so. And Christian's like, we're confused as well. We know nothing. Like, we're fine. I think in this, like, this day, it's not even just about Christian throwing his friends under the bus, though I do think that that is part of it. I think Christian may have put together that the Harga are disappearing people, and he doesn't want to be the next one on that list. So he's trying to be on, I guess, his best behavior. I don't know. Danny is like, we saw Mark go off with Inga, and Christian's like, Mark wouldn't have stolen the Ruby Rotter, but Josh definitely, like, he for sure would. And he's like, we don't know Josh, we're not associated with him in any way. The two elders are like, well, let's hope it gets returned. The book was never even stolen, so this is definitely just like mind games. Before leaving, Pele and Father Odd go to look for Mark and Josh. The two elders tell Danny that she will go with the women for the next activity, and Christian will have a meeting with Siv. And Danny is handed a Harga frock. Now, I want to bring up the costumes really quickly because the outsiders were all wearing these dark colored clothing, dark blues, dark grays, blacks. And in the scene with Danny, we see that she's wearing like a light colored like jacket over her darker American clothes. And then she is handed the Harga frock. So in the costuming, we see that Danny has fully been accepted by the Harga into their community. And it's just a matter of time at this point where she recognizes it herself. Christian like walks away and he's like freaked out and angry. But we cut to a paste being made within a mortar and pestle and then dumped into a jug to make tea, as an older woman dishes it out to each girl participating in the Maypole dance festival. One of the girls talks to Danny to like prepare her for this big festival activity. She tells Danny to like look into the woman's eyes as she gets served. And Danny's like, well, what am I being served? And she's like, it's tea. And I think at this moment we know that Danny knows that this is the same tea from earlier, from way, way earlier. And the girl teaches Danny how to cheer like a Harga. And the way that they kind of like look at each other in this moment while they're like cheering each other, it kind of is like, it's very sapphic coded. Like, you can definitely tell that there's like a tension there. But I digress. The girl does the breath thing and Danny repeats. We get an above shot of the Maypole, and we see 3 concentric circles of women standing around as the band stands off to the side. Back on the ground, we see that all non-participants are gathered to watch. They like sit on the outside of the circle. Danny's just kind of like low-key kind of freaking out in the group. And one of the Harga women begins to explain the tradition of the Maypole dance. Now, while I was watching this, there were no subtitles for the Swedish portions. But when I watched this back in 2020, there were definitely subtitles that like explained what happened. And so this may be a little off to what is being said, but this is what I remember being said around the Maypole dance. I'm pretty sure it's a story about a girl being chased by the devil and eventually collapsing where the Maypole is, and they dance as a way to celebrate her struggles, which in a way kind of reminds me of, last week with Santa Sangre and the Saint Lirio cult. I'm going to call it a cult, the Saint Lirio cult. But the Haruka woman, she claps her hand and the band starts and the girls begin jumping and dancing slowly. We cut over to the image of a bear on fire, as well as multiple other smaller images of like plants and like women. And we see that Christian is in a small room staring at these wallpapered images. A door opens and Siv brings him into her office. Christian gets up and walks in, and the camera ends up panning through a wall. Ari Aster likes to do this a lot. Both of these rooms are covered in these black and white drawings and paintings and images. Christian and Siv like stand face to each other and sit down together. At this point, we all know that everything has to be done together. And so, Christian is mimicking their traditions. Christian is like, I know nothing about what Josh did. Like, please please don't kill me, essentially. But Civ is like, well, how do you feel about Maya? And Christian's flabbers have been gasted in this moment. This is not something that he was expecting to be asked about. But Civ explains that the two of them have been improved to mate and that they're an astrological match. Christian then responds and is like, I think I ate one of her pubes. And Civ's like, yeah, that sounds like Maya. In the director's cut, this scene is extended more, and or at least this conversation is extended more, and Civ is like, well, you can count it as part of your thesis. And Christian agrees to have sex with Maya. I mean, he already was interested earlier, so I think of course, he was going to say yes here. The sexual assault of Christian is a very big aspect, or at least another big conversation that surrounds this movie. And I do have to agree, he was definitely sexually assaulted, even though in the director's cut, he said that he didn't agree to being drugged, nor, and we'll get to the specific parts of it, like he was drugged prior to having sex with Maya and the many, many women, naked women that surround him as they are having sex. But Christian ends up leaving the house to the outside world and goes to join the festivities. Cutting back to the dancing, Danny is copying everyone's movements and she's like smiling again, like genuinely. And, this is the third time in the whole movie. And from here on out, like she like smiles a lot during this dance festival. She's having fun for the first time in the entire movie. And as an audience member, you're supposed to be like, wow, I'm so happy for her that she has been able to find a community and people that she likes and that she's able to have fun. The woman from earlier calls all of them to stop, and they abruptly do so. Some of the girls fall. The music picks back up again, and the girl from earlier places Danny on the outside of the circle before they begin dancing again. As they're dancing, Danny ends up knocking someone out of the circle, and once this happens, her smile is gone, and she becomes more focused. I think she's like worried about being judged for doing that, but I don't think any of them would judge her. Christian like strolls up, completely unamused by the whole thing, and sits down to watch. And as he gets there, Maya immediately falls out and is like, "Oh no," and goes to join the group sitting down. And it's at this moment that we finally recognize that Christian looks like a fresh fish out of water, wearing his dark American clothes to the bright whites of the Harka. Time passes, and a few girls are left dancing. The girl prior congratulates Danny for being in the top 8, and the rest of the Harga do their like silent wave of celebration. Danny smiles and celebrates and looks immediately over at Christian, and Christian has like this sour face going on. She sees him as an outsider and herself as an insider, and her smile fades. The music starts again, and a girl hands Christian a glass with the tea from earlier. She tells him it breaks down your defenses and opens you up to the influence. And Christian's like, no, I don't want a bad trip. And I was like, in my notes, I was like, girl, you already have had a bad trip. Like, your friends are missing. Crazy shit is going down and crazy shit is about to go down. But she pressures him, as the group did to Danny before, and he shoots it back. Cut back to Danny dancing, and we get the stop and go of it all. They're kind of like going back and forth, and Danny's smiling again. And we get like a multitude of Danny's enter our screen, overlapping as like the drugs are kicking in. I mean, the drugs were kicking in earlier because I forgot to mention it, but she looked down and saw grass growing out of her feet. We eventually get to a point where like the final 3 girls, including Danny, are like tiredly dancing around. And one of the girls speaks Swedish to Danny, but Danny's like, what? I don't speak Swedish. And the girl is like, what? I don't speak English. And then Danny begins to talk gibberish, and the girl responds in gibberish, and suddenly they're communicating in gibberish, and it's this really cute moment. And Danny laughs, and they continue until the other girl hits the final girl, and Danny is left victorious. The woman announces Danny as the winner, and the Harga applaud and rush her. They do their silent applaud. A large flower crown is brought over, and she is crowned. And Danny's like, what does this mean? And she's rushed away, surrounded by women, and she gets draped with more flower garments. And a picture is taken of her with the Harga, and it kind of looks like a family photo. Meanwhile, all the other images of the May Queens have been by themselves, but this one is specifically for Danny to feel like she has been accepted as a part of the family. And this part is particularly interesting because Christian is left alone across the field as Danny is finally being celebrated. Everyone comes up and congratulates her by putting their face on her face, kind of doing like a forehead touch. And in this group, as everyone's like congratulating her, we see her parents walk by in Harga garb, and Danny sees them and is like, "Mom, Dad," and she slowly begins to spiral. But Pele comes up before she has a full breakdown and kisses her. And, we get everything is kind of a little trippy because Danny is very high at the moment, and on her flower crown, one flower was pulsating the entire time, but once Pele kisses her, that flower starts pulsating a little bit more. I feel like I don't have to explain the metaphor of that. A few Harga bring over a platform, and Danny stands on it, and they lift her up, and she is whisked away to the table. The Harga are singing some sort of Bahu Doris from Whoville, and leave Christian in their wake, but he ends up following behind. Everything in the background is distorted and rippling with this high, and the camera pans over to a feast made up on a dining table where at first it looks idyllic until we pan to something meaty and there are flies buzzing. And I think that is such an apt metaphor for the Harga, is that it's something that looks idyllic, but something in it is rotting away. Now at the table, the Harga all stand up and wait for Danny to be seated this time, as Danny becomes the one being celebrated. Christian slowly saunters over, but she sits down before he can even be seated. As she sits down, the leaves and the vines on her throne reach out for her as she sits down. Danny picks up her utensils and begins eating, and so does all the Harga. Eventually, Christian sits down and stares at her, obviously having an awful trip. But before they can make a connection, a woman comes over with a large herring, and it's explained to her that it's part of tradition for good luck, where she must try eating it whole. And she freaks out, she gets the tail in her mouth and drops it to the ground, and she groans. And the Harga are all like, "Oh," but then they start laughing, but not maliciously, kind of in the way that a family will laugh when you do something stupid. Christian, alone again, with his bad trip, he turns to an elderly man sitting next to him, and is like, "What's happening?" And the man claps in his face, and these ripples are sent through the ether, and Christian just sadly cries, "Why would you do that?" One of the elders stands up and clinks her glass and toasts to Danny. This is, I believe, Siv, and goes, "Willkommen Skull!" And she is cheered. Danny cheers with them, and she does the shot of what I presume to be vodka. And after she does the shot, she does the breath thing, and they are all delighted and proud of her. And she's proud of herself for doing so, she smiles. One of the girls ends up leaning over and says, "You are the family now?" And Danny smiles and exclaims yes. Danny has finally, I think, found happiness. And this feels very cathartic, at least in the way that we think of catharsis now. You know what I mean? We are getting this happiness. We're feeling happiness for Danny as a character because she's finally being seen and celebrated. And this girl tells her they are sisters. And Danny, for the first time, is not triggered by the word family. Christian's still freaking out, and he locks eyes with Maya, who stares at him intensely before leaving the table and beckons him to follow. Maya passes by Siv, and Siv stares directly at Christian. Danny notices Maya leaving and Christian staring at her, and for the third time, Danny goes, "Really? Right in front of my salad?" And Siv stands up and addresses that it is time for the May Queen to bless the crops and livestock, and she even makes a little joke about the herring. The camera shows that there is now a carriage waiting for Danny being pulled by the Harga women. Danny asks if Christian can come, but Siv is like, "Nay." The May Queen walks alone as we hear the flies buzzing again. And in this part, it definitely feels like Cinderella, this is her pumpkin carriage. And Siv kind of acts as the fairy godmother. Danny is whisked away to the carriage, is whisked away to do her May Queen duties. Christian is led away on his own for his own ritual. He notices that a road of petals are being laid out before him, kind of like the yellow brick road. Danny kind of sits worriedly in her carriage as we cut and see the carriage running through a field, and there is a hole in the ground that they then fill with grain, meat, and an egg, and cover it up with dirt once more. One of the Harga women hold the torch as well as a bough of leaves with Danny, and is said to repeat after her. She sings, Danny sings, and then they both sing together, and it's quite beautiful, their voices together. Cut back to Christian, who is now in a robe, unsteadily breathing, as two Harga elders prep him. They offer him something smoking in a vessel, and he breathes it in for vitality. And this here, kids, let me remind you, is a reminder to not mix drugs. Stay with one for the night. Don't take drugs that you don't know anything about. As this bad trip gets worse, Christian, dazed, walks into the religious building where you can hear these women's vocalizations. He's led inside where Maya is naked on a bed of flowers, and multiple naked Harga women are doing these said vocalizations. Christian enters, Maya opens her legs, and an elderly woman helps him disrobe. Cut back to Danny and the girls finishing their ritual. In this orgy, Christian mounts Maya and kisses her, and they both look terrified. In a beautiful overhead shot, we see Maya gasp and look like she's in pain. She reaches out to presumably her mother, and her mother comes down and begins singing a different tune to calm her, and Christian's face is freaked the fuck out. But the woman lifts his face, and she begins singing to him, and he continues to have sex with this underage girl. Once again, he was drugged into doing it. The bounds of this is very complicated. But we cut back to Danny and her League of Women arriving back in the village. Danny exits the carriage, and one of the women tells her that there's a meeting with Civ for only the queens. But Danny's distracted by the vocalizations and asks what that is. And the woman goes, it's not for us. But Danny goes over anyway, full frown. Walking over to this holy place, she peers through the keyhole and sees Christian also vocalizing with the women in unison. Danny gasps, begins to retch, throws up outside. Her League of Women come rushing over to carry her away as she wails. They bring her over to the sleeping quarters where they place Danny in bed, and she begins weeping and hyperventilating. She ends up crawling out of bed, and they try to shush her, but the women all grasp her, and they all begin to mimic her, with her crying and wailing as they begin to share her pain, and they all cry. And this is something that Danny is all she's ever wanted, is someone to validate her emotions. We see a mural of a woman with a golden crown flanked by 6 people and 2 naked men on fire. This is the mural I talked about earlier, where 2 naked people were on fire. The wailing continues until it is perfectly synced with the pleasurable moans. Back to an overhead shot, an elderly lady grabs Christian's ass and pushes him to help him climax. And Christian's like, what the fuck? Until Maya grabs his face and Christian finishes. Maya rocks back and forth, and in Swedish she's like, I can feel the baby growing inside me. Which I don't think... Listen, I'm a homosexual, but I don't think you can feel that happening. Is that true? Can you feel that happening? Someone tell me in the comments below. Christian gets up, realizing what he's done, and runs out of the chamber. In the outside world, Christian, still naked, and with a bloody penis, because Maya was a virgin. Once again, does this happen? I'm unfamiliar with... Please let me know in the comments below. But Christian tries escaping, but there are Harga approaching with a flower throne. He covers himself up and runs in the opposite direction. He gets to the sleeping area, but here's Danny and the women vocalizing, and he runs towards a truck and a house, and outside this house is a garden, and inside the garden he sees Josh's legs, or one of Josh's legs, sticking up out of the ground. He freaks out. He runs to a shed and sees the spread eagle flayed body of Simon with flowers in his eyes. And it looks like his lungs are inflating and deflating, but that's definitely not possible. You need your diaphragm in order to breathe. So either it's just the wind, being sucked up and through his agape mouth, or it's the high. But Christian gets down to look into Simon's eyes to see if he's alive, but there are flowers there. And when he sits back up, a Harga man is there and blows powder in his face, which immediately paralyzes Christian. The Harga man gets down on the ground and has to manually close Christian's eyes. We cut to black and we hear someone speaking to Christian. It's one of the women. She has to manually open Christian's eyes, and she explains that he cannot speak or move, and she joins the Harga again. We then get to see that Danny is placed on the opening platform with the elders, and she is wearing this giant flower gown. Like, it is just a shapeless gown of flowers, and I need it so bad. Apparently Ariana Grande tried buying it, but A24 was like, nah, and they held an auction and donated the money to a relief fund. But yeah, Ariana Grande loves this movie. Anyway, Civ begins to talk about the traditions of this particular one, the 90-year tradition. We also see that Christian is in a wheelchair. Civ explains that their deity is one of reciprocity, and gives a special thanks to the sun as they surrender 9 lives. As Harga takes, Harga also gives. Close up on Danny looking dejected. Civ explains that for every new blood, or an outsider, sacrificed, an equal number of Harga will also be sacrificed. We cut over to Reuben, laying on a cloud writing his scripture. I don't know about this or how they did this, but it's very surreal. Kind of Lynchian, actually. It is explained that 4 new bloods, 4 Harga, and 1 person will be chosen by the May Queen. We cut over and we see Maya dressed now in red and wearing red lipstick because she's a woman now. And we also learn that they will die, or these sacrifices will be reborn in the great cycle of all things. So Maya, pregnant, will have this baby, and one of them will be reborn as this baby. We learn that 4 new bloods have already been supplied, and we already know who those 4 new bloods are, and that 2 Harga had already been dedicated, that being the man and woman from the cliffs, and we see them as dolls on trees, but they were burned earlier. It looks like they were skinned and put on these trees as dolls, but also they were cremated earlier. It's complicated. I don't want to get into it. And that 2 more Harga have volunteered, those being Ingmar and Ulf. Pele is also celebrated for bringing many new blood and the May Queen. He's wearing this giant, Danny's flower crown level of extra, but with fancy leaves and ferns. It kind of is very reminiscent of the Green Man, I think, but it is up to the May Queen, Danny, to choose the 9th, either through the remaining new blood or from a Harga picked by a lottery, and this random Harga gets picked and everyone does their silent clap. He is placed in front of Danny as well as Christian, and we don't get to see her final verdict, but she's staring directly at Christian, frowning. Now, Danny obviously doesn't know that Christian wasn't totally consensual in this entire sexual act with Maya. Nor would anyone tell her, if we're being honest. But, we don't get to see her choose. We get up close of Christian's face, and although he's paralyzed and can't move, you can definitely tell what he is thinking. And this is the moment that they break the fuck up. We cut to see a waterlogged Connie being wheelbarrowed into the structure by Pele, and we see another wheelbarrow coming through with a scarecrow mark wearing a jester's hat. Now, we don't get to see what happened to Connie, and it's in a director's cut scene that we see a play being put on by the Harga of someone being drowned, one one of their folkloric figures being drowned, and it's heavily implied that that was supposed to be foreshadowing for Connie's death, but it ended up being cut for reasons. It's at this moment that we finally see inside the structure. Connie is placed gently while Mark is kind of ragdolled around and his jester's hat is jingling. We see that Simon and Josh is already in there. There's something in Josh's mouth, I don't know what it is. It might be his foot, let's be honest. And the two Harga elders are placed gently. We cut to a different building where Ingmar and Ulf are being said goodbye to by all the others. And Maya is also weeping, though she's not weeping because of these two, but rather because Christian was chosen as the final sacrifice, I think. Inside the building, an elder teaches children how to butcher a bear and remove its organs and create a cavity. Christian is wheeled over and placed next to the bear. I believe in another director's cut scene, we understand that in order for Christian to fit inside this bear cavity, he has to have his limbs removed. So interesting. Anyway, Christian's in the bear now, and also inside the yellow structure, and he looks terrified as an elder preys inside upon everyone inside. Ingmar and Ulf are given drugs so that one is not afraid and the other is not in pain. And outside the Harga vocalize, they sing. Two Harga and an elder come in carrying torches. They exhale and set fire to the three corners. Outside, we watch Danny and the Harga watch the building burn, and inside Christian just waits. He can't do anything. One, because he's in a bear. Two, he's paralyzed. Three, he doesn't have limbs. Anyway, everything burns as the music swells. Ingmar and Ulf stare at each other before burning, and Ulf screams in pain. The Harga outside immediately begin to freak out as they hear Ulf scream in pain. Danny, as the mound of flowers, stares on in anger, rage, and disappointment. It is also the first cloudy day of the entire movie, by the way, besides, the snowstorm at the beginning. Danny wails and tries to walk away. She's coughing and crying. But then it turns into laughing as this, mutual feelings turns into something horrific. It gets to a point where it starts to look performative. Where before it actually felt like they were sharing each other's grief, it just ends up becoming so over the top, it becomes this performative act. Danny ends up looking around at the Harga, and her frown turns into the biggest smile overlaid over the collapsing structure. And this is how we end the movie. What a movie, y'all. At the end of this, I always give a recommendation for watching this. And I do highly recommend watching this. This is a 5 out of 5 film for me, or I guess a 10 out of 10 film. It's just such a beautiful, cathartic movie. That ending is cathartic, but then you sit and realize that, oh wait, she's traded one abusive relationship for another, and also she's in a cult now. And not only is it a cult, it's a white supremacist cult. So are we actually supposed to be happy for her? I think we should. I think we are allowed to have this, dichotomy. You know what I mean? I think we are allowed to, one, be happy for her for understanding that her needs are finally met and that she is able to, finally grasp at who she is. But I think we are also allowed to be horrified that she has been played once more. But this time by a group of people and not just one man. I would say if you are not into horror movies, maybe don't start with Midsommar unless by the end of this you're like, wow, that really interests me and intrigues me. I think I can take it. Just know if you're going to do that and you're not into horror movies, there are going to be many scenes that just completely take your breath away and leave you with a pit in your stomach. But outside of that, if you're into horror and you haven't seen Midsommar yet, go watch it. Please, please, please. It is just such an incredible film. But yeah, that's the end of this episode. Thank you all for listening. I think it's time that I reveal next week's episode. And next week we are not covering a movie, but instead we are moving on to our next section of the podcast. So join me in discussing familial annihilation in myths and theater. I know, it's a fun topic, isn't it? Mutually assured destruction. I mean, we do get part of that in Midsommar, right? With the sister and parents at the beginning. If you would like to watch or listen to something, though, we will be particularly discussing the Agamemnon family tree, so feel free to look for Iphigenia and Aulis and the Oresteia as productions. I will also be discussing Medea, among other myths. Check out the show notes for particular productions that I think are interesting translations of the aforementioned text. With all that being said, see you next week, and stay tuned for credits. Class is dismissed. This podcast is researched, recorded, edited, and produced by me, Richard Berwind. You can find more of me on Instagram at RichardJBoy. That's Richard J Boiii, or on Twitter at BerwindRichard. Though, if you voyaged away from Twitter, you can find me on Blue Sky at richardberwind.bsky.social. You can follow this podcast everywhere at Sinister Seminar, including Blue Sky, Twitter, and Instagram. Make sure to hit follow and leave a like, comment, and rating on your podcatcher of choice. Thank you for listening.